We're going to go ahead and get started. We've reached the 3:10 mark. We have Dr. Kenneth Sufka is with us today, who wrote the A Game, and he's going to share some information with you today about student success strategies. And we're glad you decided to join us this afternoon. Really appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Maybe you should wait to hear what I have to say first. And then you'll be so depressed about the work we have ahead. Right, with working with students, you might think, oh my gosh, what now? Yes, I did write that book. I teach general psychology every semester and brain science or brain and behavior. So it's a freshman level, and then I also have this upper level class. I have about 400 students in my gen psych class, and about 100 in my brain class. And for any of you that have been teaching for more than a semester, or maybe just a few weeks, probably know that the kind of challenges students encounter, new students encounter when they enter into a college environment. And I didn't really notice this so much, maybe because my head was focused on something else as a junior faculty. I've now put in my 25th year, I've got that one in the bank. So 26 this fall. I don't know when this all kicked in, if it 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I started noticing more and more students struggling. And for me, I felt like to be responsible, I needed to help them figure out how to get past whatever roadblocks. And over that time period, what happened was I ended up with this sort of diagnostic rubric, because I knew what all the F students were doing, because I would ask them. And they would be really honest with me eventually, and it was really confusing. Why do you study like that and not in these other ways? But I figured if I had about an hour with a student, I could diagnose their problem and get them back on the right track. They might need to come back for a refresher in my office hours. And in I don't remember when I had my sabbatical to write, I think it was 2010. And it was about that time when I had an opportunity to have a sabbatical. I thought, man, I need to write down this stuff for students so that when they leave my office, they would have a hard copy of something. And that's kind of the evolution of the A Game. And so what I want to do is not give, obviously, the student-friendly version, if you've read that book. It's really pitched towards students. But instead, I want to show you the science that goes into this. I teach a graduate seminar on college-level teaching. And so I've been always interested in the literature of anything that goes into college-level teaching, and student learning was clearly one of them. So I sort of had a foot in the door of that, despite that's not what I normally do. So I'm not an expert in any of these things. I just read, and I'm a scientist, so it's like, let's use science to help us solve these problems. Now, I want to introduce you to Drew Appleby. I started reading some of his stuff. He's been all over the place, Indiana University, Purdue University in Indiana. He was at Georgia State for a while. And it was really found fascinating his perspective. And I started to communicate with him on some of his work. And it turns out, holy crap, he grew up 30 miles away from where I grew up. He took his PhD at the same place where I took my PhD. And it's like, wow, it's my long lost brother about 20 years older. And so we've really connected. And he's written multiple times about the difference in high school level learning and in college level learning. And here's a link of which I sent a PDF of all of these citations, so you don't have to worry about, you just chill out. Okay, these got uploaded in did you say they got uploaded in the Dropbox somewhere? Okay. So you can just pull that up and you just click on or whatever. Okay, so you don't just chill out. No work on your end. In reading through his stuff, he's done surveys between high school teachers and college teachers, high school students and college students, and he's identified a host of things that are fundamentally different between what happens in high school and what happens in college. And I could just summarize some of these things right here, like this first one, what's the purpose of the teacher? Well, the teacher in high school is the bearer of all knowledge, right? And they assume the students are immature and irresponsible and they'll never learn a damn thing. And that's what you teach. That's how you approach your teaching. No one in college really is like that. We assume students are mature, responsible, have some ability to learn things on their own, and then I'm going to start teaching you. Well, if you come in with the high school approach and then do the college level experience, you're going to get off the rails. Here's one. I have students that never look at their syllabus. There's no responsibility in doing that because the teacher has always told them what to do and what's happening the next day. Well, I don't do that. I already did that. It's right here. You know, again, it's the maturity, responsibility. I mean, we go back through here. What does it mean to study? I might look over my notes. Simply attending class was sufficient to get good grades. And that was probably true of all of you. If you're academics, you probably didn't study in high school and got good grades. Students may study the night before. If they think they're working hard, it might be 2 nights. And the way they study, you know, is totally, that's expectations of grades, effort. And I was there. I showed up. And I worked hard. You know, and we assign grades based on what you learn. What is the purpose of college? To get a degree and get a job. Oh, hell, I never even think about that when I'm teaching. I think about I'm going to make you an educated person. All of that other stuff will take care of itself. And so you have these fundamental differences. And I think this is just a good starting point for our conversations and what I think you might get out of something like this today. All of us are here in this workshop, but even at this university, I would hope. I mean, if you're doing this, I know that first part is true. That you care about students enough that you want to see them successful and you want to equip them with the skills to make them successful. In their personal lives and in their intellectual lives and their emotional lives. So we're all on the same page on that, and I think that there's a way to do this. Now, as I said, DX is my abbreviation for diagnosis. The A game came out of my one-on-one conversations with students to help pinpoint their problem areas. I first have to figure out what's wrong, and then we'll fix it. I mean, like you go take your car to Bub's up on Old 7, right? He doesn't like start replacing everything. Bub will first diagnose what the heck's wrong and then only fix the things that need fixing. And I think that's the way I like thinking about this A game is it helps students see where they're getting off track, or you can, and then you can begin pinpointing the things that need work. And if you want to know whether you're being successful, and I will show you some evidence of being successful, what I'm always looking for is nudging students to the next grade level. And it could be even B to A. It could be low A to high A. And certainly, of course, F to something more than an F. I think the greater thing is, you get better grades. There's pressure, of course, on universities to increase retention. And sure, I suppose faculty could be bribed and we could pass everybody because we're so tuition driven, right? What do you need? A new BMW for you, a Mercedes work for you, maybe a Quattro, without, and then we'll be...
More of a BMW.
BMW kind of guy? Okay. We could go that approach. I suppose at some point we lose our accreditation, right? But there's this huge push on retention. And you know the data on retention, right? First generation student graduates, massively changes the game for every one of their kids. Massively changes what their outlook in life is. When we hit the economic disaster of 2008 and 2009, who had the highest unemployment rate? College dropouts, or high school dropouts. Next highest? College dropouts. Next highest? And it was the bulk of the people who were struggling were people without college degrees. If you had a college degree, you were not really in a lot of trouble just yet. So I think these things all make a huge difference. I always like showing this. I know you've seen me do these talks before, and 400 students, I have to use those Scantrons. And one of the things that I'm able to do for some classes, if it's not 400 students, if it's just 100 or so, I can also print out and punch out the Scantron key so students can get instant feedback. And I think this is really important to get instant feedback because, you know, you just come up and you just put that right on top of your answer sheet. I know it doesn't look so hot, does it? And you can find exactly what you did well. And I want to show you a bunch of these Scantrons of the things, first of all, that we're having to work with in terms of student performance. Here's one from a few years back. It's my brain class. It enrolls 100 students. And the black dots that you see here up to this line represent the number of correct responses. And just to save you from counting, it's 11 out of 55. And you know, if you think of that, I know the grimace on your face is like, no, that's not true. Oh yes, that's true. And I'll admit that the brain is a hard class, but there are certainly students who can get in the upper 90s on this. And of course I have, and I know you know this, I've instituted a whole new level of grading because how is chance? And that's actually slightly less than chance. But you know, a 4-item test, or if it was a 5-item test, that'd be chance. 4-item test, 25%. I've instituted a new grading scale, and I actually send this out to students with this new category. And that is, if you are a whole letter grade below a standard F, you should know that you are a whole letter grade below that. F does not go all the way to 0 in my book. And so this I would call a legendary failure because it's so low. I mean, if you're going to score chance, add around chance, that's an LF. Giving you good feedback that you had better get on the right track now or simply drop the class, start all over, because a letter grade isn't going to get you your passing D if D is passing, which it is in some departments. Yeah. And then what's really shocking was I thought that was the worst I would ever see. And that summer session I taught this and I got somebody who got a 14. And I just thought, oh, good grief, man, I got to add a TF in there for tragic failure. But this is posted on my course syllabi. If you were to download it in my brain class, it's like, here are the percentages. If you get this, this is what I'm going to give you. Okay, let's talk about the A game and how I use it to help sort out these problem areas, okay? Now, if I were to categorize my diagnostic rubric, I'm going to ask questions in 3 really big domain areas, and I think that you'll see this if you're familiar with the A game. If you'll notice, there are some chapters in the A game that deal with the business of classroom engagement. And so I'll ask a series of questions about the things that they're doing that entail anything to do with being in the class, coming to class, and so forth. And I've really found that students that are very successful have a good set of habits that are empirically validated, and of course the tragic failure students will just completely violate all of my A game rules. Students often think that the problem with getting grades is all related to how they study. And I would argue, no, if you don't do the front end work, how you study is not going to solve your problem to get you to the A range. And so then I have a series of questions related to their mechanics of studying, their timing of studying, and practice and so forth. And what I'll do is share with you what I find as major failures in approach to exam preparation and what the evidence tells us is the best way. And then on chapter 9, the last chapter, there's a whole bunch of stuff I talk about related to testing. I always like taking a look at a few things in that little domain. I'll mention that as we move on. Now, in the classroom engagement, these are my questions that I'll ask students. And it's not surprisingly, they're questions related. Have you come to all of my lectures? And generally speaking, the really good students always come to my lectures, and the really bad students rarely come to lectures. And it turns out there's evidence There's people that have actually studied this question. You know, we don't need the science because we see it every day, but I'd like to share some of that with you. It's interesting, on the lecture seating, why is it all the good students are up in the front and all the bad students are way in the back? Why is that? And what's going on in the way back? I've got a few things to say about that. And it turns out there's some evidence there that says classroom seating makes a difference. This is always an interesting question here. What do you do before class? What do you do before class? Students have no idea what I'm talking about. It has to do with that maturity, responsibility, and my belief that they will do some work on their end so I can do my job on my end. You know, and here's a general psychology syllabus, really well worn, every single day, couple dozen pages. These are the topics that we'll cover in class. I'm doing some work right now with Dr. Carrie Dowling that's asking questions about whether preparing for lectures with syllabus reading makes a difference, and I'll get to that in a second. Another thing that I'll find is it's amazing how students will never raise their hands. And I know that there's some psychological work that inhibits students from asking questions in big classes. And the larger the class, the worse it is. And so 400 students, of course, no one wants to raise their hands. There's this phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance. And you can look that up in psychology. And so, but it's frustrating because it's not only do they not engage in classroom when they're having problems, but it seems like they won't even email you or come to your office hours until it's just utterly too late. And I'll say a few things about that. First off, let me talk about classroom attendance. There's this publication back in 2010 that just simply asked the question about, does coming to class make a difference? And this is what I found that was so shocking about this finding. Now look at this. Attendance is a better predictor. And that's the key, is a better predictor of a person's grade in a class or their overall college GPA than, and this is what was so shocking, I would have assumed, well, clearly it's their SAT score or their high school GPA supposed to be the best predictor of college GPA. The actual study skills that they engage, no. I mean, those are all positive predictors, but when you're asking the question, what is the best one? Look at that. And these row values are exceedingly high. 0.44 is the predictor of grade, 0.41 is the overall GPA, and it's actually higher for science classes. Okay, so attendance is the big factor here. And so you might have a tendency, and I talk about this in my graduate seminar on college level teaching, it's like, well, obviously I should just make everybody go to class. I'm going to have a mandatory attendance policy. Yeah, that tends not to work. So a Cohen's d effect size of that is pretty small. I mean, 0.21 is, I would say it's less than moderate. So for those of you that are familiar with that, Cohen's d, it's an effect size, how big of an effect that is. A Cohen's d of 1 is 1 standard deviation separation, which is big. And so when you see Cohen's d's of 0.5, 0.6, 0.8, 1.0, that's something to talk about. And so just making people come to class is not making a difference there. There's some other interesting things that you would say, well, it's the conscientious student that attends class. That seems like a reasonable assumption. Dang it, they looked at that. And so you can do psychometric test on this from this meta-analysis, and they said, well, you can look at all of these other things, and they certainly have a positive correlation with course grades and GPAs, but they're still not nearly as strong as attendance. And look, your row values there are pretty small, 0.16 and 0.24, when you just pick those two things. So there's something that happens in the classroom that is very, very important. And for students like my student athletes that have to miss frequently, and they see they see what happens when you miss a class. And they're like, God, but I have to travel. I have to do this for my student athletic scholarship. And I say, you need to get somebody to tape record the dang thing. And I know you can't be there physically, but at least you can listen to the lecture and go through those slides and be there in a mental way, because there's clear evidence that this is a very important effect. Now, what I want to show you next is how I can tell whether somebody has missed one of my lectures by looking at one of those Scantrons. And so here's one from my brain class that is a kind of the exemplar case of a student turning in an exam. And I always do this too. It's always funny how a student will give me this, and I'll hold up this, hey, do you want some instant feedback? No. It's like, oh, really? And so it's like, oh, I'll look. And they're still standing there, and I looked at this one and I said, dude, you missed one of my lectures. And he's like, it's a 100-student class. Could you imagine a professor, 100 students? And I had 5 lectures on this test. And I said, dude, you missed the third exam. You missed my third lecture. He was dumbfounded. How did I know? Because I have perfect photographic memory. Because I can just do math. And I showed him that. I said, look, you missed 20%, or you got 20% of the answers correct on the day that you missed. Because all of this was from lecture 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there's a few left over. And when he looked at that, he was just as shocked. Once again, how did I pick him out? And I said, well, did you get lecture notes from somebody? Yes. Fair enough. So, and you've interacted with me enough to know I'm kind of a smart aleck. So then I said, well, did you study them? I mean, come on, if you're going to go chance, wouldn't you agree that you got them, but you never studied them? No, he actually studied them. I said, well, that's rule number 1 of the A game. That just proves it to you. You got to come to class. Now, what's that second rule? That was chapter 1, right? Skip class, I can pick you out just like that. And that's a really good example of that. This guy should have gotten, somewhere around like 75, low 70% on that test, and that dropped him a whole letter grade. It's like, that's on you. You should have come to class. On classroom seating, there's some interesting work that goes on here, not as studied as attendance, but there are some goodies. So this group tried to survey, they tried to find out where students sit, and that's a pretty good situation where apparently you've clocked from your classes for 15 years where everybody sits. I never do that. But what they basically found was the sweet spot, in my opinion, is kind of front and center, is the sweet spot, is associated with better grades, and people are more likely to attend. But there's some other studies that I found that also point to this. So this was a physics class. And what they found was, if you take the poor students in the back and the good students from the front, and you push them both directions, the bad students from the back up to the front, the good students from the front up to the back, you start seeing shifts in the ratio of good grades. There tends to be a higher percentage of A's up here, a higher percentage of F's back there. But if you push them around into different, by mandatory reassignment, it actually increases their grades. And then there's this one here in an economics class that followed up the same thing from a physics class, and you get the same outcome. More A students tend to sit in the front, more D and F in the back. If you push them the other direction, you harm the good students and you benefit the terrible students. Now, I got to tell you about this. You read this, I just found this hard to believe. It's like, really? So, you've been in Fulton Chapel before, it seats 500 students. So I asked the class, I used to teach in there until the art department, or no, the theater department kicked us out, because apparently some accreditation thing, you gotta have access to that 24/7. You can't teach in there any longer. Which is okay by me, because I now teach in Nutt, a much superior facility, and it's only 400. So there I am up here lecturing, and you know there are two huge aisles. And then I just kind of cut it in thirds and asked students, tell me where you were seated in the previous unit on the exam. That was, and here's what I found out, because I wanted to confirm what the other articles were saying. It's not a scientific study, but the average grade of sitting in these sections 1 and 2, the sweet spot, was 82%. You go back to the middle, it dropped a whole letter grade. And you go back to the far reaches, you get another whole letter grade drop. Now, I love this study because I'm a psychopharmacologist and in psychopharmacology we always talk about dose effects. So you get more of a drug, it should produce a bigger effect in our animal models that we test. And like this is a dose effect, in my opinion, of instruction. The closer you get to the good stuff, the more that good stuff's going to stick with you. I show this to my class in a student workshop, and following this workshop, this is what my class in Nutt Auditorium looks like. 15 minutes before class. So I'm a Tuesday, Thursday, so that class is usually empty 15 minutes before I start. And if you look very, very closely, 15 minutes before starting, with the exception of those two knuckleheads right there, this class is filling from the front to the back. So they've taken that, like, oh crap, this is a real deal. So, there's that. And of course you all know what happens in the back of these rooms back here. I've sat in the way back and evaluated other people teaching, and all kinds of crap goes on back there, right? You've got, I'm going to be texting, I'm going to be posting something on Facebook, I'll be watching something on YouTube, I'll be shopping. God knows what's going on. I mean, when I was in college, I admit I read the student newspaper. If the lecture was boring, I had that sucker out, probably just totally pissed off the teacher. But there's so much electronic media out there now that's vying for student attention that you really have to think of those things as the new WMDs in the classroom. And there's a science that is showing that if you let students do this stuff, it interferes with their learning. And I'm going to share one of those studies with you right now. It was published in one of the Teaching of Psychology journal. And I want you to pay very close attention to the title of this paper, because I always thought that was really funny. It's like, wow, that is pretty clever. Texting in class equals you fail, frowny face. What did the teacher do? Well, the teacher asked the class, how many of you students in here have unlimited texting? And a certain number of students raised their hands. And she said, just text away through the whole lecture. And those without unlimited plans were told to stay off their phones from texting. And she said, I encourage you to even text about the damn material, whatever. And then at the end of the class gave a quiz. So it's really basically texters and non-texters. And it's not a complete random assignment, just so you know, okay? And here's what she found on the quiz. Percent correct on the quiz as a function of texters and no texters. And you'll notice 60 versus 80%, that's a 2-letter grade drop. Whew, 2 letter grades with a WMD. Now, understanding that that's not a total random assignment, there was a replication where it took people with unlimited texting and randomly assigned those to texting, non-texting, and you get Same effect, not as robust. It's still a whole letter grade, texters and non-texters, and the percent correct on the quiz. And this shows you that modern social media is killing students on so many levels, particularly in the classroom. And I don't really know what to do about this anymore. I got into the face of one of the students about texting in class, and it turned out he was freaking writing lecture notes with his thumbs on his phone. I couldn't believe it, and I said, show me. And he did, and it's like, good God, I cannot believe that you're doing this with that. Many students think, well, I need to have my laptop. And I'm going to argue that you probably don't need to have your laptop or your phone or anything else. And here's the study that shows that you don't need that. Many people think that they can take lecture notes very rapidly on a computer. And there's no doubt that there are data that show that. In fact, if you do just a simple word count, and here's a study that did that in psychological science. If you do a simple word count between handwritten and on a laptop wins the day. You have more words. But that's not really the important question, right? The important question is, how do you perform on an exam in one format or the other? And here are the data on this. It's the performance in a Z-score. So how you compare on a Z-score of all grades between laptop note takers and longhand note takers. Okay, so far so good. For two types of questions. So the factual questions would be basically, well, definitions, the lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy. And the conceptual level questions is like where they go off the rails. So despite having more words, not necessarily content, more words, you don't get a benefit. And I'm beginning to think maybe it's time for me just to tell students, you're banned. And they're banned because I have a responsibility for you not to harm yourself. And laptop doesn't make much of a difference on those easy questions, but look at the Z-score differences there, and that's significant. And it's been attributed to, and here's the interesting thing, and you're not surprised. When I listen and I have to paraphrase, I have to reprocess. And that's going through all the good stuff in your brain. And I'm a brain scientist, so I can say that. If you are listening and taking notes verbatim, that bypasses all the good stuff. That just goes through the auditory cortex and right out through Wernicke's area, maybe, if any of you know that, right out into your motor skills. So there's no reprocessing in any of the stuff that matters. So that's not surprising to see this kind of effect. So here's what researchers tried to do in a follow-up, and I don't have the data here, but they basically said, well, we'll teach students to use their laptops and take notes by paraphrasing. That lasts for a few minutes, and because note-taking on laptop is such an automatic process, from years and years of doing that, you cannot sustain that. So you can't even teach students to paraphrase on that. It's not worth the effort. So I'm beginning to think about just packing up, getting rid of that stuff. I'll say two things about the pre-lecture prep. And I'm doing this work with, again, Dr. Carrie Dowling. We hired her a few years ago. Really talented teacher, really loves working with students. So we've enrolled students who are asked to watch me lecture and then take a quiz a week later. So it's just simply watch this lecture, take a quiz later. But what our question was very simply, does it matter on test performance if you read the material beforehand or afterwards? And so those were two of the three groups. So everybody got to read the assignment out of the textbook. You either got to read it before you saw me lecture or after you saw me lecture. And we had one more group in there to make the third group, and that was because some students do this, they don't read at all. So, here's what our early analyses are showing. Reading before lecture outperforms reading after lecture. That shouldn't surprise people who have watched students do these things. But here's what was so shocking to us. Reading after lecture is equivalent to not reading at all. The benefit you're getting from reading has to do with a phenomenon in cognitive psychology that's, I'm going to kind of bend this word a little bit, priming. It's not real priming, but essentially it's getting your cognitive processes to begin to structure large amounts of content. Learning something from scratch is harder than learning something and attaching it to something that you already sort of know. I mean, Piaget even talked about this sort of stuff in child development and cognition. And so, as soon as I tell students, read before class, when they've never done that, all of them will say, wow, that lecture was really easy to follow, as if it was an easier lecture. No. And then you go look at their notes, and you look, and their notes are more thorough, more organized, and they've got something now to work with. So coming to class prepared, sitting in the sweet spot, and then this point about taking advantage of when you don't understand something, you've got to fix that, and you've got to fix it now. And right after class, if you're afraid to raise your hand, go to the office hours, send emails. You can't wait until the night before. You need to get that and get that fixed right away. So if you look at those first 4 chapters, and I ask students when they're coming up with these tragic failure grades, and they say, I need some help, I'll say, all right, read the A game first, and then tomorrow when we meet, I want to know how many rules you violated. They're pretty embarrassed when they've got legendary tragic failure. They're like, yep, I did every one of those. Every one of them. It's like, well, good, now we got a starting point. So it's no surprise. Students believe strongly that they are highly skilled, regardless of their own ability level. You understand there's a literature that actually shows that. There was this really great paper. I keep thinking about putting this in or not putting it in. It's the Kruger and Dunning from 1999. It was in JPSP. It's a very highly ranked journal in psychology. And it's basically asking students, well, I mean, the title tells it all, unskilled and unaware of it. Unskilled and unaware of it. Many students will come to the test saying, I know it all. But it turns out there's a population of students, a significantly large population of students, that actually don't know where they fall in a class rank. They will say, I know all of that stuff and I ought to get 75, 80%. And how difficulties to recognize own competence leads to self. Okay, so what they did is they tested groups of students on humor, logic, and grammar, asking them to do a couple of things. And that is, we're going to rank you into quartiles. So who's the top 25%, second, third, and fourth? And we want you to figure out where you fit on that. And I want to show you what the various quartiles look like. So this is the percent, okay, actual performance relative to their perceived ability. This is how you're going to look at these 2 lines. Across these 4 ranking of actual performance, these 4 quartiles of students. So I have tested them. In this case, it's a test of humor. And of course, the 4 quartiles rank up just how they should be. That's what their actual scores were. But look at the bottom quartile thinks that their own ranking is somewhere in the middle. And in the second quartile is, again, I'm in the top half. It's like you're not even close to the top half. You're in the bottom quartile. And what's interesting is there's only one quartile that's actually kind of close to assessing where they think they are on a performance. And it's always interesting, the top quartile tends to kind of underestimate their ability. What are the students that you're likely to deal with? Well, it's obviously, these are the ones that are running through all those EDHE classes and that are coming for help. And of course, they're like, well, I thought I knew everything. And you have to just get into the mind frame of, I believe you. But really, where you're putting yourself, that's like people who are on the other side of the distribution. And this holds up across, the second one was logic, and the third one was grammar. And again, it's actual test score, what they thought their test score was. So they asked 2 questions: what do you think your ability is, and then what your test score was. And there's really no difference between what they think their ability is and what they think their test scores are, but it crosses the boundary from humor to logic, and then it also holds up for grammar. It's that bottom 2 quartiles that think they're coming to college equipped with everything they need to do and do okay and be in the top half. And then if I work harder, I can get even better grades. And it's like, oh, good God, no. You're like, some of you are in the bottom quartile, and working hard might get you out of legendary failure to failure. I've always polled students about what they do in studying, and this is a fairly commonly endorsed technique that students describe. I highlight as a method of studying, okay? Most students also say that they read over their notes or they read over their highlighting, and they tend to do it once or twice, maybe 3 times. Some folks will rewrite lecture notes. Any of these sound familiar for the veterans, the veteran teachers? Okay, good. I have students that show me big decks of flashcards. They can work. I think what's really frustrating is some stuff that I read in the New York Review of Books by Anthony Grafton, who's someone who's been in higher ed and writes on issues of higher ed. Him and Del Banco are probably 2 big contributors to New York Review of Books in terms of anything related to higher education. And Our Universities, Why Are They Failing was the title of this one, an oldie but goodie. And you ask students, how many hours per week do you study? And the current generation of students, and it might even be lower now, report 12 hours a week. It's like, whoa. Wow, that just amazes me. It's like, what are you doing with all of that extra time? You know, you got 15 hours in the classroom, 12 hours of studying. That's not even a full-time job. And then, but notice, in 1981, the survey reports 20 hours, 1961, 25 hours. Now we're kind of talking about somebody doing full-time work. Also, you would think like the really good schools, like the University of California, the public elites, woohoo, with all the really bright students, they're not working any harder, so this is an endemic problem. Grafton started adding up the hours that they do other crap. They spend about an equal number of hours on social media, just on social media. And then there's like hobbies. And that was one of the things I found really interesting. It's like 3-4 hours a week on hobbies. Like, what the hell? Who had time for a hobby when you were in college? Well, maybe you did. I did. But all of those other hours are non-academic hours. It's just shocking. And if you want that, that's the link to that thing. When I'm doing my diagnostic rubric and I get past those first 4 questions, I start asking them about study sessions. And the question really is, when did you start studying for the exam? When did you start studying for the exam? And of course, the A students have always been studying, and the F students just started studying because that's what you can do in high school. You could just do the night before. Or if you did study in high school, you would think, God, I gotta have to study now. Or if you studied one night before an exam in high school, you might do 2 nights. And there's a literature that has asked the question about the study sessions, and it's it's an older meta-analysis, but it has some really interesting findings. So lots and lots of studies have been performed, and probably, well, I can think of a dozen more now that could have been included into a newer meta-analysis. But essentially what they did is they found 63 studies that compared people who were given an opportunity to study the same amount of time, spread out, spaced out study sessions, or distributed is what they would call it, versus massing all your study sessions. And what the data show, and it shouldn't surprise you, is pretty clear. If you distribute them over a longer period of time, fixed amount of time though, so you're controlling for that, spacing them out outperforms massing it all together in one big chunk. And at Cohen's d, a moderate effect size of 0.46 is pretty impressive. Now, here's the interesting thing that has to be mentioned as you work with students who might be juniors or seniors. And it's this point that comes out of this paper. That effect size changes. If you increase the complexity of test material, the effect size goes down. So easy material, you can get by with a bunch of spaced out study sessions. If you have really complicated material, so this would be like going from my intro class to my brain class. Here's what they discovered. You need to have time off in between those study sessions. A day on of studying brain, a day off. A day on of studying brain, a day off. So to get the biggest bang for your buck of spreading out your study sessions, for complicated material, you've got to have time off in between. Well, now you're talking about getting students to kind of back up and really begin planning their lives weeks out in advance. I'm going to show you how I can tell whether somebody is doing an all-nighter. And if you've read the A Game, there's a little exercise in there to prove this to students. There's a phenomenon in cognitive psychology called the serial position effect. What you get students to do is you have them try to memorize a string of letters or words, a long list, about 20 long. It's way more than anybody could possibly memorize. And then you ask for immediate recall. So it's a little bit different, but what I'm trying to show is put in a bunch of information in a single session. How much of it can you recall instantly? And what you get is a phenomenon that looks like this, the serial position effect. And it's the percent correct as a function of where that item appeared in the list. And what students do when they're mentally fresh with a clear working memory, you can recall those early items pretty quickly. But as you get into the middle of the list, the transfer of information to long-term memory is disabled because you've already clogged up the machinery of your working memory. They tend to have a tiny boost on the back end. It's called the recency effect. The reason that I want to show this is that I can identify students who are doing all-nighters because the same thing happens when you do an all-nighter. Think of it. What am I doing? I'm studying, the beginning of my unit, so I'm going to study that lecture material first and then keep going on in my study session. Hour number 2 is rolling around, that next lecture, and then hour 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And they might get some sleep, usually, and then they come in and take a test. So here's an exam from, again, a brain class. And what I really want you to focus on is the high level of performance in these first 2 columns. And then it drops completely off. And so if you kind of look at that up here, they got 20, 40, 60, 70% correct, 20, 40, 60% correct, and it's 20, 40, 40, 0. Again, do you know the story? Here's my exam. Oh, do you want instant feedback? No. I mean, yeah, let me just take a look. And it's like, oh, dude, you pulled an all-nighter. Yeah, man, how did you know? Well, because I'm a stalker, right? I was watching you all night long. So this person got 41% correct, which is beyond the F range, and could have gotten somewhere in the 65-70% range had he done something differently. Now, for those of you that think, well, yeah, he's just a 70% student anyway, he wasn't very smart. It's like, oh, this stuff happens to even the best students. Look at this student. 90% correct in the first column, 90% correct in the second column. Oh, what do we have here? 40%, 30%, 40%. Jesus Lord. It's like, dude, man, you pulled an all-nighter. Yeah, I had 3 exams this week, and I just got around to yours. Did the student get an A? No. Well, I'm an A student. Well, you could have been an A student if you had not violated rule number 5 and started earlier. And it's like, oh my gosh, you know, the science and the actual evidence is so clear. Again, if you're thinking about helping students out in an upper division class, I say it's sort of, you got to kind of approach it this way, is you kind of always need to be studying, but make sure you do it every other day. If it's something easier, we know you don't need to have the time off in between. At least that's what the meta-analysis says. Over here, now I start asking these other really hard questions. So we haven't even asked how you study. We just ask, do you come to class? Are you prepared? When do you study? Now we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of studying. Do you create any learning outcomes or learning objectives? They have no idea what I'm talking about. Okay, then I back up. Do you know what you need to know? Well, I need to know everything that's in this pile of notes. Can you be a little more specific? Well, I guess I need to know this table. Can you be a bit more specific? I guess I need to know there are 4 characteristics that differentiate rods and cones. 4 things that differentiate rods and cones. That's what I need you to say to me. That's a learning objective, not I need to know this crap in this thing. And you know, Charles Brewer, any Furman grads? Furman grads? No Furman grads? Dang. If you were a Furman grad, you'd know this guy, Charles Brewer. He's legendary. And he's filled with all these Brewerisms, as they're known. That's one of my favorites. If you don't know where you're going, the chance of getting there borders on randomness. Well, if you don't know what to study, you could just study any old thing you want here. And I start pulling out all kinds of crap from my students. It's like if you'll never get to the finish line because you don't know what to study. I don't understand what you mean by that. So here I try to break all this down. How do you study? Well, students say, well, I read over my notes. And then here's what I like showing them. This is in that handout. This is hilarious. Are there any data to show that reading over notes, okay, make a difference? And the answer is yes, there is. So there's this huge monograph by Dunlosky that I'm in your handout citation. It's a beast. But if you're interested in student learning, you could cuddle up with that baby and befriend it. Inside that, they cite a paper from '68 on whether there's any evidence that rereading makes a difference. They've got 4 groups of students. They were all given a passage to read, and then broken into 4 groups. One group was tested a week later. This one got to read it once, take the test a week later, twice, take the test later. I show this to my students. It's like, well, there's evidence to suggest that rereading makes a difference. Here, look. If you don't reread, it's not so good. But look, you can nearly double your test score. Yeah, that's good. And I said, if you read it one more time, man, you get like another whole letter grade improvement. Look, that's like another 10%. Oh, man. I said, you don't really need to be reading 3 or 4 times because it's not going to make any difference. And they're like, yeah, and they're feeling pretty good about their rereading. And then I say, what is your grade you're going to get by rereading? Legendary failure, epic failure, somewhere in the failure range, right? And what's weird is When you actually find a student that has scored in the mid 40% on an exam, and that's what they do is reread, and you'll say, well, they got 40-some%. What'd you get on that test? And they're like, oh, 40-some%. Well, I guess it's just exactly the science shows that you can get 40-some% correct. That's me being a smartass, but it's like, come on. Now you've got it right in front of you. This is not what you do. So people become familiar with material when they reread, and so if you haven't seen the A-Game book, you would never be able to answer this unless you're a coin collector. Please pick out the correct penny. Well, I've seen a penny a bunch of times. Yeah, I know what a penny looks like. And then they do this exercise in class, and it's like, I'm just trying to prove to you that rereading isn't deep processing. You need to do something deeper. And of course, you all know what the answer is now. Who has never seen this before? Anybody has never seen this? Come on, admit it. No pluralistic ignorance. Do you mind if I call you out to ask you which one is the penny?
Go right ahead.
Which one? Can we eliminate a few of them? Of course.
Yes, we can.
And on a multiple choice test, by rereading or familiarity, I can eliminate these don't look right for some reason. That just seems weird, and it's true. He does not look that way. And then there are a few other ones that don't look right, but dang it, that's it, that's close. And some other ones, like there's something weird about that one. At the end of the day, you can't pull it out, and that's what I try to emphasize to students. This shows you that your approach can eliminate some obvious incorrect, but it doesn't help you narrow down the right one. It's A, if you were wondering.
I was.
One of the things in chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is I help describe how to do concept mapping as a strategy for student success. Joe Novak, Cornell University biology professor, came up with these things to help organize information into meaningful ways. It is a learning goal. And a tremendous amount of research shows that converting text lecture notes into a picture relationship can improve student learning outcomes. Here are some references if you don't believe me. Sola Adesope, who is now at Washington State University, is becoming a major figure in doing meta-analyses. And I didn't even know he was there, but I was asked to give a lecture there a few years ago. And holy cow, he's in the audience and I'm citing his work. And it's like, oh, how cool. What he's shown is that students that make concept maps, holy cow, a 0.82 effect size is huge. Now, sometimes teachers give them out and it's like, yeah, you're not helping them. If you get students to make their own, they perform better. And so in my class, I like showing how you might make them in terms of Parkinson's disease. You simply start building out this cobweb of connected things. Like if you want to know about a neurological disorder, you need to know those 4 things. This is what we teach in my brain class. And then you just start building out the spiderweb. I give this lecture over an entire week. And so you're going to take 2 weeks worth of stuff and start making connections. And you keep on building out. There are these drug and surgical therapies that are for this. Here's some for a couple of classes that students really like making these concept maps. Here's another one as I'm trying to get through this. What you find is that you get about a letter grade and a half improvement over students that don't make concept maps in some studies out there. Now they have to be of sufficient quality in terms of the minimum number of connecting nodes. So people have studied that. I'm going to make a weak concept map of say 20, 25 nodes versus some who have 50, 60 nodes, and you get a dose effect, as you can imagine, with that. I don't really like flashcards. I'm going to kind of skip over that stuff. And the reason I don't like flashcards is that people don't know how to make good flashcards. They tend to only deal with test questions that are just factual. They pull out the key terms. Look, my exams, it's 50% factual questions, even multiple choice exams. I have about 35% application and about 15% conceptual level questions. And if you don't make flashcards at that level, the best you're going to do is around 50%. And of course, I mentioned this in the A game, that in college, you've got to know this, but we're always teaching and you're being tested on these higher level things. I didn't want to throw the Bloom's taxonomy out there for the students because I thought that was a little bit too challenging. For those of you that are doing higher ed stuff, I mean, you've grown up with this and you know what that is. I just try to simplify it for them. Here's a young lady that did flashcards. She also missed a lecture, and I just wanted to show you, of the 39 out of 55 correct, I'm going to show you what she missed on factual questions. She gave me a big stack of flashcards. She missed one question on my exam that was fact. Pretty impressive. The problem is, here are the application type questions on my exam, and she missed those. There wasn't a single application type question, and here are her, in green, the conceptual level questions missed. And when I pointed out, it's like, you violated that rule of the A game. It shifted everything, and she started to learn at higher levels. So I'm being forced to kind of hurry up here. This is the big, powerful one right here, self-testing. And here are some citations I wanted you to know. These are some of the early studies that have started looking at retrieval practice, rehearsal learning, or what I just call self-testing. This is chapter 8 of the A game. Big, powerful effects. In fact, I'm going to skip this slide just to get past it so I can give you this paper that's hot off the press by Adesope. 2017, he's finished up this meta-analysis. Hedges is another effect size, Hedges G. And what he found was a Cohen's D of 0.61 outperformed all other study strategies. And there are the experiments that he ran. And what they're finding is this Cohen's, or this Hedges G, ranges from in the 0.5 to 0.8 range, depending upon a lot of other variables. Interesting, the comparative task is how do you make your own multiple choice test. Not so good. You make your own conceptual level fill in the blank test or short answer, bigger effect. Test format is another factor. Educational level works best in secondary, then primary, then post-secondary in terms of rank order. So here's some great data there. I do want to show you just one student that came in from a summer session. Summer sessions are bad. Dang, 4 weeks, you're in my class 2 hours a day, 5 days a week for 4 weeks. You have an exam every 5 exams. There's like exam every 3 days. It was pretty bad. She came in after the first exam, actually 2 days after the first exam, and that was her score. And what was she doing? Came to class, sort of sat in the front, never prepared, reread. Remember what I said about rereading? That's right there, 44%. Went through the diagnostic checklist, spread out your study sessions, although we were taking a test in 2 days. All these other skills. This is her test on the second exam. Huh, not so bad. She came back to my office and said, what were those other things you told me to do? And I said, well, are you self-testing? Are you creating clear learning objectives? No. How do I self-test? Taught her how to do that. Here's her score on the next test.
Oh, wow.
98%. 40, so obviously legendary failure, up to almost the highest score in the class. So these anecdotal reports show that these things work, but this reference here, this was a commissioned work by huge names in the field of learning. And essentially what they did was they were asked to survey all of the literature out there, all of the science, on 10 types of studying that students engage in. Selecting things that were hot, like self-testing, concept mapping, and spreading out study sessions, but also things that students just did on their own, rereading, highlighting some other things. And their big finding here, they are, you can get to that, is they would recommend any technique that worked in any kind of learning environment, among any kind of student, under any kind of testing, and one other factor. I forget what it was. There were 4 factors. Like, crap. You're only going to recommend stuff that works for any kind of teaching style, any kind of student, any kind of test format, and so forth. And their take-home message was, and these were the 10 things, and I wanted to point out that practice testing 8 and 9, distributed practice, were the spaced out study sessions and rehearsal learning. And their final recommendations were that the one that they could highly recommend among all the others, there were only 2. And it turns out to be chapters 6 and 8 in the A game. And that's spread out your study sessions and self-testing. It works for any kind of student, for any kind of material, for any kind of test environment, taught to you in any format. Those 2 things. There were some that were sort of tenuous recommendations, and of course, highlighting, underlining, and rereading, they just booted that one clean out. So, anyway, so this material is up on your Dropbox if you want to get those citations. And that's how the A game came about being, is the science behind it dovetailed nicely with what I saw successful students doing and what unsuccessful students were not doing, and that's why it's organized in that kind of rubric. And I know you guys, I kept you 5 minutes longer than I should, I apologize. So, thank you very much.